The gentle December snow fell outside Eleanor Mitchell's living room window as she carefully polished the Christmas china plates that had been her husband Harold's gift for their 30th anniversary. Each delicate porcelain dish featured hand-painted holly and pine cones around the edges with a subtle gold trim that caught the light from her modest chandelier. As she worked, she hummed Silent Night under her breath, a melody that had been the first dance at their wedding reception 50 years ago. 10 years, she whispered to the empty room. 10 years we had these plates together. Harold, now it's been 3 without you. At 67, Eleanor had grown accustomed to speaking to her late husband as if he were still sitting in his favorite armchair by the fireplace. The doctors called it a normal part of grief, but to Eleanor, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Harold might be gone, but their conversation had never truly ended. She placed the last plate back in its protective sleeve and returned the set to the china cabinet that dominated her dining room wall. The cabinet was filled with Memory's crystal glasses from their 25th anniversary, silver candlesticks that had belonged to Harold's mother, and, of course, the Christmas plates. Eleanor ran her finger along the cabinet's polished wood, remembering how Harold had built it for her during their first year in this house, back in 1980. "You always said I needed somewhere proper to display the nice things," she said, smiling at the framed photo of Harold that sat atop the cabinet. The picture showed him at their son James's college graduation, beaming with pride, his arm around both Eleanor and their only child. The doorbell's chime interrupted her reverie, sending Eleanor's heart into a fluttering rhythm of hope. At her age, after 3 years of widowhood, every unexpected ring held the promise of companionship, even if it was just the delivery person with her monthly book club selection. Eleanor smoothed her cardigan and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her silver hair was neatly styled in the bob she'd worn for 20 years. And though her face showed the gentle mapping of time, her blue eyes still sparkled with the curiosity that Harold had always said was her most enchanting feature. "Coming," she called, hurrying as quickly as her arthritic knees would allow. When she opened the door, a genuine smile brightened her face. "James, what a lovely surprise." Her son stood on the porch, tall and broad-shouldered like his father had been, though his face carried Eleanor's softer features. At 38, James Mitchell was the spitting image of Harold at that age, right down to the way he carried his shoulders slightly forward when he was stressed about work. Today, those shoulders were definitely hunched. "Hi, Mom," he said, leaning in to give her a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. "Sorry I didn't call first." "Nonsense. You never need to call before visiting your mother." Eleanor stood aside to let him in, noticing how his eyes darted back to the sleek BMW parked in her driveway. "Is Melissa with you?" "She's on a call," James replied, glancing at his watch. "Important client. She'll be in shortly." Eleanor nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. Her relationship with her daughter-in-law had always been polite but distant. Melissa Klein had come into James's life 6 years ago, a whirlwind of ambition and sophistication that had swept her son off his feet. They'd married after just 8 months of dating, a timeline that had concerned both Eleanor and Harold, though they'd kept their reservations to themselves. "I've just made a fresh pot of coffee," Eleanor said, leading James into the kitchen. "And I think there might be some of those oatmeal cookies you like in the tin." James followed her, his footsteps heavier than usual on the hardwood floors. "That sounds great. Mom, thanks." As Eleanor poured the coffee, she studied her son from the corner of her eye. James had been a serious child who'd grown into a serious man, but today he seemed particularly tense. His eyes kept flicking to his phone, which he'd placed face up on the kitchen island. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked, placing a steaming mug in front of him. "You seem worried." James took a long sip before answering. "Everything's fine. Just busy at work, end-of-year reports, client meetings, the usual December chaos." Eleanor nodded, knowing there was more to it than that. James had always been a terrible liar, another trait he'd inherited from Harold. She decided not to press the issue and instead placed the cookie tin within his reach. "And how are things at the new house? Have you finished the renovations in the master bathroom?" "Almost," James said, perking up slightly. "The Italian marble was delayed, but it should arrive next week. Melissa has been incredible at coordinating everything, even with her schedule at the firm." Eleanor smiled, genuinely happy to see some of the tension leave her son's face. She's certainly efficient. I've always admired that about her. The truth was more complicated. While Eleanor did admire Melissa's drive and organizational skills, she'd often wished those talents came with a bit more warmth. Since Harold's passing, James and Melissa's visits had become increasingly rare and brief. Last Christmas, they'd stopped by for only 45 minutes before rushing off to a party at Melissa's boss's house. The front door opened without a knock, and Melissa's voice echoed through the house. I told them we'd have the proposal by Monday, but they're insisting on Friday. It's completely unreasonable considering the holidays, but what can you do when it's your biggest client? Melissa appeared in the kitchen doorway, her tailored charcoal pantsuit immaculate despite the light snow falling outside. At 35, she was strikingly beautiful, with sharp features, expertly applied makeup, and dark hair cut in an expensive bob that somehow made Eleanor's own similar style seem dated by comparison. "Hello, Eleanor," Melissa said, finally glancing up from her phone. "Sorry about that. Crisis at work?" "No need to apologize, dear. I understand how demanding your job can be." Eleanor moved to pour another cup of coffee. "Would you like some, God, yes, double shot if you have it?" Melissa slid onto the stool beside James, finally putting her phone down, though Eleanor noticed she positioned it so she could still see any incoming notifications. "So," Eleanor said, trying to keep her tone light, "this is a pleasant surprise. I wasn't expecting to see you both until Christmas Eve dinner." James and Melissa exchanged a quick glance that sent a flutter of concern through Eleanor's chest. "Actually, Mom, that's sort of why we're here," James began, fidgeting with his coffee mug in the way he'd done since childhood whenever he had something difficult to say. "We've had a change of plans," Melissa cut in, her tone brisk and practical. "The renovations at our house are taking longer than expected, and my parents' condo is simply too small for entertaining." Eleanor blinked, trying to follow the conversation. "Entertaining for our Christmas Eve party," Melissa explained, as if it were obvious. "We're hosting 32 people this year, colleagues and business partners. It's crucial for James's promotion prospects." "Oh," Eleanor said, a sinking feeling in her stomach. "So you won't be coming for dinner here." Another glance between the couple. This time, James spoke up. "Actually, Mom, we were hoping to host the party here. Your house is perfect, plenty of room. Great entertaining space, and that big kitchen." Eleanor's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. "Hear you want to have your business party here." "It would be such a help," Melissa said, her voice taking on the cajoling tone she used when she wanted something. "Your house is always so quaint and Christmassy. Everyone at the firm has been stressed with the Anderson merger, and a homey Christmas Eve is exactly what they need. But I haven't hosted a party since your father died," Eleanor said softly to James. "I'm not sure I'm up to it." "You wouldn't have to worry about anything," Melissa assured her, though her eyes had already returned to her phone screen. "We'd handle all the planning. We just need the space. And maybe your help with the food." "The food," Eleanor repeated, her voice faint. "Mom's an amazing cook," James said to Melissa, as if Eleanor weren't sitting right there. "Remember that pot roast she made last Easter?" "It was delicious," Melissa agreed, looking up with a practiced smile. "And you're always saying how you miss cooking for a crowd. Eleanor, now you'd have 32 appreciative guests." Eleanor felt a flutter of panic. 32 people is quite a lot, and Christmas Eve dishes can be complicated. We'd pay for all the ingredients, of course." James interrupted. "And I could come help that morning." "We've already drafted a menu," Melissa added, reaching into her designer handbag and pulling out several printed pages. "Nothing too complex. Traditional Christmas fare with a few modern touches to impress the partners." Eleanor accepted the papers with trembling hands and scanned the list: beef Wellington, rack of lamb, 12 different appetizers, 8 side dishes, and 5 desserts, including a croquembouche that Eleanor had never attempted in her life. "This would take days to prepare," she whispered. "That's why we're asking now, to give you plenty of time," Melissa said, her tone suggesting she was being incredibly reasonable. "The party starts at 7 on the 24th, so everything would need to be ready by then." Eleanor looked at her son, hoping to see some recognition of how overwhelming this request was. but James was staring into his coffee cup, avoiding her eyes. "I don't know," Eleanor said, trying to summon her courage. "This seems like a lot for someone my age to manage alone." "You wouldn't be alone," James said quickly. "I told you, I'll come help that morning." "For a few hours," Eleanor pointed out. "But this menu would require days of preparation." "Mom!" James finally met her eyes, and Eleanor saw a flash of the little boy who used to beg for an extra cookie before bedtime. "This party could mean everything for my career. The senior partners will all be here, and if I impress them, that associate position is as good as mine." Eleanor felt her resistance crumbling. Since Harold's death, supporting James had become her primary purpose. How could she refuse to help her only child advance in his career? "Let me think about it," she said weakly. "We really need to confirm today," Melissa pressed. "I have to send out the invitations by tomorrow." Eleanor looked down at the menu again, then at the hopeful expression on her son's face. Harold's voice seemed to whisper in her ear. "Our boy needs you. Ellie, you've always been his biggest supporter." "All right," she said finally. "I'll do it." The relief on James's face was immediate. "Thanks, Mom. You're the best." Melissa's smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she checked her watch. "Wonderful. Now we should get going. I have a conference call in 40 minutes. As they gathered their things to leave, Eleanor felt a strange hollowness in her chest. James hugged her briefly at the door, whispering another thank you, while Melissa was already halfway to the car, phone pressed to her ear again. Eleanor stood in the doorway long after the BMW had disappeared down the street, snow collecting on her shoulders as she tried to process what had just happened. Finally, the cold drove her back inside. In the quiet of her living room, she picked up the framed photo of Harold from their last Christmas together. His kind eyes seemed to hold a question. "I know what you're thinking," she told the photograph. "You're wondering if I'm letting them take advantage of me. But he's our son, Harold. What else could I do?" The silence that answered her felt heavier than usual. The following 2 weeks passed in a blur of shopping lists, recipe research, and increasingly sore joints as Eleanor prepared for the Christmas Eve feast. James had dropped off an envelope of cash for ingredients, but the amount barely covered half of what the extensive menu required. Without complaint, Eleanor dipped into her modest savings to make up the difference. As promised, James stopped by occasionally to check on her progress, but his visits were brief and distracted. Each time, he'd glance at what she was working on, offer a quick word of encouragement, and then leave with some excuse about work or helping Melissa with another aspect of the party planning. 5 days before Christmas, Eleanor was elbow-deep in pie dough when her phone rang. She wiped her hands on her apron and answered to find Melissa on the line. "Eleanor, I need to make a change to the menu," Melissa said without preamble. 3 of our guests have celiac disease, so we'll need gluten-free options for everything." Eleanor felt her carefully constructed timeline crumbling. "Gluten-free, but I've already purchased most of the ingredients." "I'm sure you can adapt," Melissa interrupted. "There are thousands of recipes online. Just Google it." "Melissa, I'm not sure I know how to make gluten-free pastry for the Wellington." "I'm counting on you to figure it out, Eleanor." Melissa's voice took on a sharper edge. "This party is crucial for James's career. You wouldn't want him to miss out on a promotion because of dietary restrictions, would you?" The implied accusation hung in the air between them. Eleanor closed her eyes, counting silently to 10, as Harold had taught her to do when dealing with difficult people. "I'll do my best," she said finally. "Perfect. Oh, and don't forget to decorate the house. I want everything to look festive but elegant. No tacky inflatable Santas or anything like that." After hanging up, Eleanor sank onto a kitchen stool, suddenly overwhelmed by the scope of what she'd agreed to do. Her hands, already chapped from constant washing and food preparation, trembled slightly as she reached for her reading glasses to research gluten-free baking. The doorbell rang just as she'd found a promising recipe for gluten-free pastry. Sighing, she made her way to the front door, hoping it wasn't another complication from Melissa. Instead, she found Margaret Olson standing on her porch, holding a poinsettia plant and wearing the bright smile that had been a constant in Eleanor's life for over 40 years. I haven't heard from you in days, Margaret announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I was beginning to think you'd run off with that handsome widower from the library book club. Despite her exhaustion, Eleanor laughed. George, he's nice enough, but I've sworn off men who talk about their golf handicap within 5 minutes of meeting you. Margaret, a spry 70-year-old with a crown of white curls and a penchant for colorful scarves, followed Eleanor into the kitchen and stopped short at the sight of the chaos. Good Lord. Ellie, what's happened here? Are you cooking for the entire town? Eleanor gestured helplessly at the sprawl of ingredients, bowls, and recipe printouts covering every available surface. James and Melissa are hosting their Christmas Eve business party here. 32 guests. I'm doing the cooking. Margaret's expressive face darkened. They're what? Please tell me they're paying you. They're family, Margaret. I don't need payment. Family shouldn't exploit you, Margaret said bluntly, setting down the poinsettia and examining the menu Melissa had provided. Good grief, Eleanor. This would challenge a professional catering team, let alone a 67-year-old woman with arthritis. I can manage, Eleanor said, though her voice lacked conviction. Margaret fixed her with a penetrating stare. Can you? You look exhausted already, and the party's still days away, Eleanor sighed, finally allowing herself to voice the doubts she'd been suppressing. I'm doing it for James. This party could help his career. And what is James doing for you? Margaret asked pointedly. When was the last time he stopped by just to spend time with his mother, not to drop off grocery money or check on party preparations? The question stung because Eleanor knew the answer. Since Harold's death, James's visits had become increasingly functional rather than social. Phone calls that used to last an hour had dwindled to 5-minute check-ins, usually while he was commuting to or from work. He's busy, Eleanor said defensively. His job is demanding, and Melissa has him wrapped around her little finger, Margaret finished. Just like she's trying to do with you. That's not fair. Margaret, she's ambitious. That's all. Ambition is fine. Using your widowed mother-in-law as unpaid kitchen staff is not. Margaret's expression softened as she took Eleanor's hand. What would Harold say if he could see you running yourself into the ground like this? Eleanor's eyes drifted to the Christmas card displayed on the refrigerator, the last one Harold had given her before his heart attack. She'd memorized the message inside. My dearest Eleanor, for 40 years you've been the heart of our family. But don't forget that hearts need care too. Never let anyone take advantage of your kindness. Love you always and forever. Harold. He'd tell me I'm being a pushover, Eleanor admitted quietly. But he'd also understand why I'm doing it. James is all I have left of him. Margaret squeezed her hand. Harold would want you to help James. Yes, but not at the expense of your own well-being. And he certainly wouldn't want you to let that daughter-in-law of yours treat you like hired help. Eleanor felt tears threatening and blinked them away. What would you suggest I do? Cancel with only 5 days' notice. I'm not telling you what to do, Margaret said, reaching into her purse for a brochure. I'm just suggesting you know your options. Eleanor took the glossy paper, recognizing the palm trees and beaches of Florida's Gulf Coast. What's this? My sister Betty's timeshare in Naples. I'm flying down on the 23rd to spend Christmas with her family. There's an extra bedroom with your name on it, if you want it. Florida for Christmas. Eleanor shook her head. I couldn't possibly. Why not 78 degrees, white sand beaches, and Betty's famous key lime pie for dessert? Sounds a lot better than slaving over a hot stove for people who won't appreciate it. James would be devastated if I left. Maybe he needs a little devastation to appreciate what he has in you. Margaret stood, straightening her colorful scarf. The offer stands until the 23rd. Just think about it. After Margaret left, Eleanor returned to her pie dough with a troubled mind. The Florida brochure sat on the counter, its sunny images a stark contrast to the snow falling steadily outside her kitchen window. What do you think, Harold? She asked the empty room. Is Margaret right? Am I letting them take advantage of me? As always, no answer came, but Eleanor found herself wondering for the first time what Christmas might be like somewhere warm, somewhere without expectations, somewhere she could simply be a guest rather than the host. December 22nd arrived with a fresh snowstorm and an even fresher complication. Eleanor was inventorying her serving platters when her phone rang with Melissa's distinctive ringtone. "Eleanor, we have another dietary issue," Melissa announced without greeting. "Two guests have severe nut allergies. We'll need versions of every dish that are completely nut-free." Eleanor closed her eyes, summoning patience. "Melissa, I've already had to adapt everything for gluten-free options. Now I'll need to start over again for nut-free versions." "Not start over," Melissa corrected impatiently. "Just make additional versions. The regular dishes, gluten-free options, and now nut-free alternatives. It's not that complicated." "It's 3 versions of an already extensive menu," Eleanor pointed out, her voice trembling slightly. "That's over 60 different dishes to prepare in 2 days. I'm sure you'll manage. You're always saying how much you love to cook," Melissa said dismissively. "Oh, and make sure the house is spotless. The senior partner's wife is rather particular about cleanliness." After hanging up, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, staring at the mountains of ingredients she'd already purchased and prepared. Her hands, cracked and sore from constant work, lay uselessly in her lap as she contemplated the impossible task ahead. The doorbell rang, startling her from her stupor. It was Margaret again, this time carrying a small suitcase. "I'm on my way to the airport," she announced, stepping inside. "Last chance. Ellie, there's a ticket with your name on it if you want it. Betty's already made up the guest room." Eleanor gestured helplessly at her kitchen. "I can't. Margaret, look at all this. I've promised." Margaret surveyed the scene, then fixed Eleanor with a stern look reminiscent of their teaching days together 40 years earlier. "Who are you more afraid of disappointing? Eleanor, your son, or yourself?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that the Eleanor Mitchell I've known for half a century wouldn't let anyone, not even her beloved son, treat her this way. The Eleanor I know values herself enough to say no when necessary." Eleanor felt a flicker of something long dormant inside her, a quiet dignity that had gradually eroded since Harold's passing. "It's not that simple. It never is," Margaret agreed. "But ask yourself this. What lesson are you teaching James by letting him and Melissa use you like this? That it's acceptable to treat people, especially family, as means to an end?" The question hung in the air between them. Eleanor looked again at the Christmas card on her refrigerator. Harold's handwriting, a comforting ghost from the past. "Never let anyone take advantage of your kindness." "I'll think about it," she promised. Margaret nodded, satisfied for now. "My flight leaves in 3 hours. I'll keep my phone on until boarding. If you change your mind, call me. Betty can book you on tomorrow morning's flight." After Margaret left, Eleanor moved through her kitchen like a woman in a trance, mechanically continuing her preparations while her mind worked through a different problem altogether. When the doorbell rang again an hour later, she was surprised to find James on her porch, looking harried and checking his watch. "Hey, Mom. Sorry to drop by unannounced. I can't stay long." Eleanor stepped aside to let him in, noticing how he barely made eye contact as he headed straight for the kitchen. "Wow, you've been busy," he commented, surveying the partially prepared dishes. "Everything on track for Christmas Eve." "Actually, James, I wanted to talk to you about that." Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Melissa called earlier about more dietary restrictions. I'm concerned about managing all these different versions of each dish." James frowned, checking his phone. "What restrictions? 2 guests have nut allergy. That means I need to make 3 versions of everything regular, gluten-free, and nut-free." "Can't you just make everything nut-free and gluten-free?" James asked, his attention already drifting back to his phone. "That would compromise the traditional recipes," Eleanor explained patiently. "The Wellington crust won't be the same. The stuffing loses its texture. The desserts—" "Mom," James interrupted, finally looking at her properly. "This party is really important for my career. The senior partners never socialize with associates outside of work. This is my chance to show them I'm partnership material." "I understand that, James. I'm just not sure I can physically manage all this by myself. I'm not as young as I used to be." "You're only 67, James said dismissively. "Mrs. Abernathy at church is 82, and she still makes all those cookies for the bake sale." Eleanor felt a flicker of irritation. "Mrs. Abernathy makes 6 dozen cookies once a year. Not a 3-course meal with multiple variations for 32 people. James sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so reminiscent of Harold that Eleanor's heart ached. What do you need more money for ingredients? Should I see if Melissa can come help on the morning of the party? The suggestion that Melissa, who Eleanor had never once seen cook anything more complicated than microwave popcorn, might help was almost laughable. What I need is for you to understand what you're asking of me, Eleanor said quietly. This isn't just about cooking, James. It's about respect for my time and energy. Something flashed across James's face, a brief moment of recognition, perhaps even shame before his phone buzzed with a new notification, pulling his attention away once more. I have to take this, he said, already moving toward the door. We'll talk more later. Okay, thanks for everything, Mom. You're the best. The front door closed behind him before Eleanor could respond, leaving her alone with her thoughts in a kitchen full of half-prepared food. Slowly, she walked to the china cabinet in the dining room and opened the glass doors. The Christmas plates gleamed in their protective sleeves, waiting for their annual moment of glory. Eleanor carefully removed one, running her finger along the hand-painted holly pattern. What would you do, Harold? She whispered. As she held the plate, memories flooded back not of elaborate dinner parties or perfectly executed meals, but of simple Christmas Eves spent with Harold and James, the three of them eating dinner on these special plates, then attending the candlelight service at church. Later, they would drive around town to see the lights, returning home for hot chocolate and one early present each before bed. Those moments warm, intimate, filled with genuine connection, felt a universe away from the performative spectacle Melissa was orchestrating. Eleanor returned the plate to its sleeve and closed the cabinet doors. With sudden clarity, she knew what she needed to do. She picked up her phone and dialed. Margaret, it's Eleanor. Is that ticket still available? The morning of December 23rd dawned clear and cold, with sunlight glinting off the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Eleanor Mitchell stood in her bedroom, staring at the small suitcase open on her bed. At 67, she had never done anything like this before, never defied expectations, never prioritized her own needs over others, never simply walked away. Am I really going to do this, Harold? She murmured, holding his photograph in her trembling hands. The smiling face of her late husband offered no verbal response, but Eleanor could almost hear what he would say. It's about time. Ellie. Her phone chimed with an incoming text, Margaret, confirming her flight details. Departure at 10:45 a.m. from Cleveland Hopkins International. Arrival in Fort Myers at 2:17 p.m. In just over 6 hours, she could be standing on a Florida beach instead of slaving over a hot stove. Eleanor took a deep breath and continued packing, unlike her usual meticulous planning for trips. This hasty escape meant bringing only essentials, a few lightweight outfits thankfully kept from their retirement trip to Arizona 3 years ago, comfortable shoes, basic toiletries, medication, and Harold's last Christmas card, which she carefully tucked between layers of clothing. The doorbell rang just as she was zipping the suitcase closed. Eleanor froze, heart hammering in her chest. Had James somehow sensed her plans? Or worse, was it Melissa coming to add yet another complication to the already impossible menu? She crept to the front window and peered out, relief washing over her when she saw the FedEx truck pulling away. On the porch sat a small package, likely the specialty vanilla beans she'd ordered for the croquembouche that now would never be made. As she carried her suitcase downstairs, Eleanor caught sight of her kitchen. Every surface was covered with partially prepped ingredients, chopped vegetables, marinating meats, measured spices, and printed recipes marked with her careful annotations. Days of work and hundreds of dollars, all waiting for the final assembly that would never happen. For a moment, guilt threatened to overwhelm her resolve. What would happen when 32 hungry guests arrived tomorrow evening to find no food prepared? What would this do to James's career prospects? How would Melissa handle such public embarrassment? Eleanor set her suitcase by the front door and returned to the kitchen. She wouldn't leave them completely stranded. Taking a fresh sheet of stationery from the drawer, she began to write, Dear James and Melissa, by the time you read this, I will be on my way to Florida to spend Christmas with Margaret and her sister's family. I'm sorry for any inconvenience this causes, but at 67, I find I'm no longer physically able to prepare such an elaborate meal for so many people with multiple dietary restrictions. I've done as much preparation as possible. You'll find partially completed dishes in the refrigerator and freezer, with instructions attached to each. The pantry is fully stocked with all necessary ingredients. As an alternative, I've taken the liberty of calling Donovan's Catering. Their card is on the counter. They can accommodate last-minute holiday orders if you call them before noon today. I've prepaid a deposit of $500 from my own savings to hold a reservation for you. James, your father would want me to remind you that family relationships should never be transactional. The past few weeks have made me feel more like hired help than your mother. I know this isn't entirely your fault. You've been caught between your wife's expectations and your mother's feelings. But it's time for you to decide what kind of son you want to be, and what kind of man your father raised you to be. Melissa. I've tried my best to be the mother-in-law I never had, supportive, non-interfering, and generous with my time. But respect must go both ways. I hope someday we can find a relationship based on genuine connection rather than convenience. I can be reached on my cell phone after 3 p.m. today, should you wish to talk. With love, despite everything. Mom, Eleanor. She read the letter twice, making sure the tone was firm but not unkind. She had no desire to burn bridges, only to rebuild them on more solid foundations. Eleanor placed the letter prominently on the kitchen island, weighed down by a small ceramic angel that had been a gift from James when he was 12. Then, with a deep breath, she turned to survey the kitchen one last time. The Christmas plates caught her eye, gleaming behind the glass doors of the china cabinet. On impulse, she opened the cabinet and carefully took out one plate, wrapping it in a kitchen towel before placing it in her handbag. A small piece of home to take with her, a reminder of happier Christmases past. The taxi arrived exactly at 8:30 a.m. Eleanor locked her front door, half expecting last-minute intervention from James or a demanding call from Melissa. But her phone remained silent as the driver loaded her suitcase into the trunk. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Eleanor resisted the urge to look back at the house that had been her home for 42 years. Instead, she looked forward, toward a Christmas she had chosen for herself. The Cleveland airport bustled with holiday travelers, but Eleanor moved through the chaos with a growing sense of liberation. Each step away from home felt like shedding a layer of obligation, revealing the woman she had been before grief and loneliness had made her so desperate for family connection that she'd accepted mistreatment. Margaret was waiting at the security checkpoint, her white curls topped with a flamboyant red hat adorned with fake holly berries. "You actually did it," she exclaimed, embracing Eleanor tightly. "I was half convinced you'd back out at the last minute." "I nearly did," Eleanor admitted, returning the hug. "But then I remembered something Harold used to say about boundaries. Smart man. You're Harold." Margaret linked her arm through Eleanor's as they headed toward their gate. "He'd be proud of you today." Eleanor's phone buzzed in her purse. She tensed, seeing James's name on the screen, but let the call go to voicemail. "He'll be angry when he finds the letter." "Let him be angry," Margaret said firmly. "A little righteous anger might do that boy some good. Make him think about how he's been treating his mother." They found seats at the gate, and Eleanor finally allowed herself to check her voicemail. James's voice came through, tense and confused. "Mom, where are you? I stopped by to drop off some serving platters Melissa wanted to use, but you're not home. Call me back as soon as you get this. We need to go over some last-minute details for tomorrow." No mention of the letter. He must not have gone into the kitchen. "He doesn't know yet," Eleanor told Margaret, a fresh wave of anxiety washing over her. "Maybe I should call him back. Explain before he finds the letter." Margaret placed a firm hand over Eleanor's phone. "And give him the chance to talk you out of it." "No, he'll find the letter when he finds it. Right now, this is about you doing something for yourself for once." The boarding call for their flight saved Eleanor from having to decide. As they joined the line of passengers, she turned her phone to silent and tucked it deep into her purse. Whatever storm was brewing back home would have to wait. 30,000 feet above the American heartland, Eleanor stared out the small airplane window at the patchwork of fields and towns below. She'd only flown a handful of times in her life, always with Harold arranging the details. always with a clear itinerary and purpose. This spontaneous journey felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "Penny for your thoughts," Margaret said from the seat beside her. "I was just thinking about James as a little boy," Eleanor replied. "He was always so considerate. If I was tired, he'd bring me a blanket without being asked. If I was sad, he'd draw me pictures to cheer me up. Children change when they grow up. It's natural. But to this extent, sometimes I hardly recognize him anymore. Margaret, after Harold died, something shifted. It's like he became a different person." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Grief affects people in strange ways, but I also think Melissa has something to do with it. She's very controlling." "James always had a weakness for strong personalities," Eleanor admitted. "Even in high school, he dated girls who made all the decisions. Harold used to worry about it." "Did he ever talk to James about it?" "He tried, but James would just say he liked being with someone who knew what they wanted." Eleanor sighed. "I think Harold was concerned that James might end up with someone who wanted the wrong things. Like using his widowed mother as free catering staff." Margaret raised an eyebrow. Eleanor didn't answer, instead turning back to the window. Somewhere down there was her son, probably just discovering her letter, probably furious and hurt and confused. The thought sent a pang of guilt through her chest. "You did the right thing, Ellie," Margaret said softly, seeming to read her thoughts. "Sometimes people need a wake-up call. I just hope I haven't damaged our relationship beyond repair." "If your relationship can be irreparably damaged by you standing up for yourself once in 67 years, then it wasn't much of a relationship to begin with." The plane began its descent into Fort Myers, and Eleanor felt a strange parallel between the aircraft's downward trajectory and her own plunge into uncharted territory. For decades, she had been the reliable one, the accommodating one, the one who could always be counted on to put others first. Now, she had disrupted that narrative with one decisive act. What kind of Eleanor Mitchell would emerge on the other side of this journey? Betty Olson's beach house in Naples was everything Eleanor's snow-covered Ohio home was not airy. Modern, filled with light, and just steps from the Gulf of Mexico. The moment she stepped through the door, the tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders for weeks began to dissolve in the warm Florida air. "Welcome to paradise," Betty greeted her. Every bit as exuberant as her sister Margaret, but with a deeper tan and a collection of seashell jewelry that clinked melodiously when she moved. "How does it feel to be a rebel at 67? Eleanor laughed despite herself. "Terrifying, exhilarating. I'm not sure yet." "Well, you're just in time for sunset margaritas on the deck," Betty announced, taking Eleanor's suitcase. The perfect cure for winter blues and family drama. The beachfront deck offered a spectacular view of the Gulf, its waters turning golden in the late afternoon sun. Eleanor sank into a comfortable chair, accepting the salt-rimmed glass Betty offered her. "I haven't had a margarita since Harold and I went to Cancun for our 40th anniversary," she admitted, taking a cautious sip. "Then you're long overdue," Betty declared. To new traditions, as the three women toasted, Eleanor's phone vibrated in her pocket. She'd turned the sound back on after landing, half expecting a barrage of calls from James, but her phone had remained surprisingly quiet during the ride from the airport. Now, seeing her son's name on the screen again, she hesitated. "You should answer it," Margaret advised. Better to face the music now than let it fester. With a deep breath, Eleanor accepted the call. "Hello, James." "Mom," his voice was tight with controlled emotion. "I found your letter." "I see." Eleanor motioned to Margaret and Betty that she would take the call inside. She walked through the sliding glass doors into the cool, air-conditioned living room. "I assume you're upset." "Upset, Mom? You've left us completely stranded. 32 people are coming tomorrow night, and you've just run away to Florida." Eleanor winced at his choice of words. "I didn't run away, James. I made a choice to remove myself from an impossible situation. An impossible situation that you agreed to." "Yes, I did." Eleanor acknowledged. "And that was my mistake. I should have been honest from the beginning about what I could realistically manage. But James, you and Melissa kept adding more and more requirements, gluten-free, nut-free. specific serving dishes without any consideration for the amount of work involved. We offered to help. No, you didn't, Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. You offered money for ingredients, which didn't even cover half the costs, by the way, and you said you'd help the morning of the party, which would have been far too late for most of the preparation needed. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a slightly less confrontational tone, James asked, "So what are we supposed to do now the partners are expecting a home-cooked Christmas Eve dinner?" I left the number for Donovan's catering on the counter. I've already paid a deposit. If you call them immediately, they can still accommodate you. A catering service, Mom. That completely defeats the purpose of having the dinner at your house. We wanted a homey, personal atmosphere. No, Melissa wanted to use my home as a free event space and me as free kitchen staff, Eleanor corrected gently. There's a difference. Another long silence. When James spoke again, his voice had a wounded quality that tugged at Eleanor's heart. I can't believe you'd do this to me, right before the most important networking event of my career. Eleanor closed her eyes, steeling herself against the guilt trip. I'm sorry for the timing. James, truly, I am. But this isn't something I did to you. This is something I did for myself. By leaving a nasty letter and running off to Florida. Was the letter nasty? Eleanor asked, genuinely concerned. I tried to be fair. James sighed heavily. It wasn't nice to read. Let's put it that way. Sometimes the truth isn't nice to hear. Eleanor moved to the window, watching the sunset paint the Gulf waters in shades of orange and pink. James, I love you. You're my only child, my connection to Harold, the most important person in my life. But the way you and Melissa have treated me these past few weeks, really, these past 3 years since your father died, has been hurtful. Mom, that's not fair. We've been busy with our careers, the house renovation. Too busy to spend more than an hour with me at Christmas last year. Too busy to call except when you need something. Too busy to consider that I might have feelings and limitations. Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. Your father would be so disappointed. James. The invocation of Harold seemed to hit home in a way nothing else had. There was a long pause before James responded, his voice subdued. What do you want me to do? Mom, cancel the party. Ruin my chances at making partner. Of course not. I want you to call the caterer, have your party, and advance your career. But I also want you to think about the kind of son you've been, and the kind of son you want to be moving forward. Another pause. And you're really staying in Florida for Christmas? Yes, I'll be back on the 27th. So you won't even talk to Melissa about this? She's pretty upset. Mom, Eleanor felt a flash of irritation. Melissa has my number. She's welcome to call me herself rather than sending you to manage her emotions. That's a bit harsh, perhaps, but I'm tired of triangulation. James, if Melissa has something to say to me, she can say it directly. In the background, Eleanor could hear a woman's voice, presumably Melissa asking for the phone. There was a muffled exchange, and then Melissa's crisp, professional tone came through the line. Eleanor, this is completely unacceptable. Do you have any idea how this makes us look to James's colleagues? Eleanor took a deep breath. Hello, Melissa. I imagine it's inconvenient, and I apologize for that. But as I explained to James, I've provided a solution with the catering service. A catering service isn't the same as a home-cooked meal. The whole point was to show the partners that we're family-oriented, traditional people who value home and hearth. Then perhaps you should have valued the person creating that home-cooked atmosphere, Eleanor replied evenly. Rather than treating me like an employee who couldn't possibly have limits or needs of her own. I don't have time for this, Melissa snapped. Some of us have real responsibilities. The comment stung, reinforcing every negative feeling Eleanor had been harboring about her daughter-in-law's attitude toward her. I understand you're upset, Melissa, but I've made my decision, and I won't be returning before Christmas. The caterer's number is by the phone. I suggest you call them immediately if you want to salvage your event. There was a click as Melissa ended the call without saying goodbye. Eleanor stood motionless by the window, phone still pressed to her ear, as the last rays of sunset faded from the sky. The sliding door opened behind her, and Margaret stepped into the room. From your expression, I'm guessing that didn't go well. Eleanor sank onto the nearest chair. James is hurt. Melissa is furious. And I don't know how I feel. Guilty, relieved, liberated, terrified, all of the above, Margaret suggested, sitting beside her. Yes, all of those. Eleanor set her phone on the coffee table, screen down. Was I wrong to leave them in the lurch like this? You didn't leave them in the lurch. You provided a perfectly good alternative with the caterer. Margaret took Eleanor's hand in hers. You're allowed to have boundaries. Ellie, you're allowed to say no. Even to your son. Even at Christmas. Eleanor nodded slowly. I know that intellectually. It's the emotional part I'm struggling with. That's because you've spent your entire life putting everyone else first. It feels wrong to prioritize yourself because you've never done it before. Margaret squeezed her hand. But let me tell you, as someone who's been practicing the fine art of saying no for decades, it gets easier with time. Betty appeared in the doorway, another round of margaritas in hand. Family drama dispensed with for the evening. For now, Eleanor confirmed, accepting the fresh drink gratefully. Good, because Christmas Eve waits for no woman, and we have beach decorations to put up. Betty gestured toward a box of fairy lights and tropical Christmas ornaments. Ever decorated a palm tree before? Eleanor. Despite the emotional turmoil of the phone call, Eleanor found herself smiling. I can't say that I have. Well then, Betty declared, raising her glass. To new experiences. As they toasted, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a tentative embrace of this unexpected turn in her life's journey. For 67 years, she had defined herself primarily through her relationships with others. Daughter, wife, mother, grandmother-in-waiting. Perhaps it wasn't too late to discover who Eleanor Mitchell was on her own terms. Christmas Eve morning in Naples bore no resemblance to the snowy Ohio days Eleanor was accustomed to. She woke to brilliant sunshine streaming through gauzy curtains and the distant sound of waves breaking on the shore. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Where was the weight of responsibility that usually accompanied her Christmas Eve mornings? No turkey to baste, no potatoes to peel, no dining table to set with the good china. Instead, she had nothing but time, stretching before her like the empty beach visible from her window. Eleanor slipped out of bed and padded to the small balcony adjoining her guest room. The Gulf of Mexico stretched to the horizon, its waters shifting from turquoise near the shore to deep blue in the distance. A few early morning walkers strolled along the water's edge, some with dogs frolicking ahead of them. It was beautiful, peaceful, and utterly foreign to her experience of the holiday season. A knock at her door interrupted her reverie. Ellie, you up for a beach walk before breakfast? Margaret called. Betty's making her famous key lime pancakes, but they won't be ready for another hour. Give me 10 minutes, Eleanor replied, already moving to unpack her lightest outfit, white linen pants and a pale blue blouse that she'd bought for a cruise with Harold that his illness had ultimately prevented. As she dressed, Eleanor checked her phone. No missed calls from James or Melissa, though she hadn't really expected any after last night's conversation. There was, however, a text message from an unexpected source, her neighbor Doris, back in Ohio. Eleanor, is everything okay? James and Melissa were at your house until very late last night, and there appeared to be quite a commotion. Call me when you can. Eleanor sighed. She could imagine the scene, James trying to salvage what he could from the partially prepared ingredients while Melissa paced and made angry phone calls. She sent a quick reply to Doris, assuring her that everything was fine and promising to explain when she returned. Margaret was waiting in the hallway, already dressed in flowing beach pants and a wide-brimmed hat. Ready for your first Florida Christmas Eve. As ready as I'll ever be, Eleanor replied, tucking her phone into her pocket. Though it feels strange not to be cooking right now. That's the beauty of it. Betty and I have our Christmas Eve traditions down to a science. Beach walk in the morning, light brunch, afternoon by the pool, early dinner at Bamboo Cafe, then the candlelight service at Naples Community Church. Margaret linked arms with Eleanor as they headed downstairs. All you have to do is show up and enjoy yourself. I'm not sure I remember how to do that, Eleanor admitted as they stepped onto the warm sand. It's been so long since I wasn't responsible for everyone else's holiday experience. Then it's high time you learned. Margaret kicked off her sandals, encouraging Eleanor to do the same. Feel that warm sand between your toes on Christmas Eve. Doesn't that beat standing over a hot stove all day? Eleanor had to admit it did. The sensation of soft, warm sand underfoot was deliciously indulgent, as was the gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt water rather than roasting turkey and cinnamon. They walked in companionable silence for a while, collecting interesting shells and watching pelicans dive for their breakfast offshore. Eleanor gradually felt the knot of tension she'd been carrying begin to unravel. "I brought one of my Christmas plates with me," she confessed to Margaret as they turned to head back. "Wrapped it in a dish towel and tucked it in my handbag. Isn't that silly?" "Not at all. It's a piece of home, a connection to Harold." Margaret stooped to pick up a perfect sand dollar. The things that matter most are rarely the big, showy gestures. They're the small touchstones that carry our memories and values. Eleanor thought about the Christmas plate, carefully wrapped and tucked in the drawer of her guest room. "Harold gave me that set for our 30th anniversary. He said even everyday meals should be special sometimes." Smart man. He would have hated seeing those plates used for Melissa's business networking event. Eleanor realized aloud. He always said Christmas Eve was for family only, no phones, no work talk, just being present with each other. "Then I'd say you've honored his memory by bringing one plate here, where Christmas will be about genuine connection, not networking." Margaret handed Eleanor the sand dollar. "Here's your first Florida Christmas decoration." By the time they returned to the beach house, the aroma of key lime and maple syrup filled the air. Betty was flipping pancakes on a griddle, wearing an apron that proclaimed Santa Surfs in Florida. "Perfect timing," she called as they entered. "Grab plates and dig in. We've got a full day of Christmas relaxation ahead of us." As Eleanor sat at the sunny breakfast table, watching pelicans soar past the window and enjoying food she hadn't had to prepare herself, she felt a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The guilt over leaving James and Melissa was still there, hovering at the edges of her consciousness. But it was gradually being displaced by something else, a tentative joy in rediscovering herself. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a text message from James. "Called the caterer. They can handle dinner tonight. We need to talk when you get back. Merry Christmas. Mom." No mention of love, no warmth, but at least a Merry Christmas and an acknowledgement that they needed to talk. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a start. Eleanor sent back a simple reply. "Thank you for understanding. Merry Christmas to you and Melissa. Love, Mom." She set her phone aside and turned her attention back to the moment at hand. Good food, dear friends, and a Christmas Eve unlike any she had experienced before. Later, as they prepared to leave for the candlelight service, Eleanor carefully removed the Christmas plate from its makeshift wrapping. She ran her finger along the hand-painted holly pattern, remembering all the Christmas Eves it had witnessed James as a little boy, eyes wide with excitement, Harold carving the turkey with meticulous precision, family gathered around the table sharing stories and laughter. On impulse, Eleanor placed the plate on the small desk in her guest room and arranged her modest collection of Florida treasures upon it, the sand dollar from their morning walk, a particularly beautiful shell Betty had given her, a sprig of local greenery that wasn't holly, but had a similar festive feel. "My Florida Christmas altar," she murmured to herself, taking a photo with her phone. Not to send to anyone, just to keep for herself a reminder that traditions could evolve, that happiness could take unexpected forms, and that sometimes the greatest gift was the permission to begin again. As the three women drove to the church that evening, Eleanor gazed out at the palm trees illuminated with Christmas lights, so different from the snow-covered pines of Ohio, different, but beautiful in their own way, just as this new chapter of her life might be, if she had the courage to embrace it. The Christmas Eve service was both familiar and strange, the same carols and scripture readings she'd known all her life, but delivered in a bright, modern church rather than her traditional stone sanctuary back home. When the congregation lifted their candles for Silent Night, Eleanor closed her eyes and allowed herself to be fully present in the moment, letting go of regrets about the past and anxiety about the future. For tonight, at least, all was calm, all was bright, and for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor felt a genuine sense of peace. Christmas morning dawned with a brilliance that still surprised Eleanor, golden sunshine flooding through the windows instead of the muted gray light of an Ohio winter. For a moment, she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the distant rhythm of waves against the shore and trying to process the strange reality that this was, indeed, Christmas Day. No grandchildren to anticipate, though James and Melissa had been married for 5 years. They remained focused on their careers. No turkey to put in the oven. No carefully wrapped presents arranged beneath a decorated tree. Just the gentle sound of the Gulf and the faint aroma of coffee drifting up from Betty's kitchen. Eleanor reached for her phone on the nightstand, prepared for the usual rush of Christmas morning messages. But there was only one notification, a brief text from James sent late the previous night. Party went fine. Caterer saved the day. Melissa still upset. Merry Christmas. The terseness stung, but at least he had reached out. Eleanor typed a reply. Glad the party was a success. Attending a beach service this morning with Margaret and Betty. Different, but beautiful in its own way. Merry Christmas. Dear, love, Mom. She hesitated, then added a photo of the Christmas plate she'd arranged with her Florida treasures. Not as an accusation or reminder of what she'd left behind, but as a small bridge, an offering that said, I'm still your mother, still carrying our traditions, just in a new way. Eleanor set the phone down and prepared for the day, choosing a light sundress that Harold had always loved, pale yellow, with tiny white flowers that she hadn't worn since his passing. The woman in the mirror looked somehow different this morning, still 67, still showing every year of her life in the lines of her face, but there was a clarity in her eyes that had been missing for some time. Merry Christmas, Harold, she whispered to her reflection. I think I'm finally doing what you always wanted me to do, taking care of my heart. Downstairs, Betty and Margaret were already busy in the kitchen, assembling a breakfast that smelled divine. Merry Christmas, Sleeping Beauty, Betty called cheerfully. Hope you like crab and avocado omelets, our Christmas tradition since we gave up on snow 15 years ago. It smells wonderful, Eleanor replied, accepting the cup of coffee Margaret handed her. Can I help with anything? Absolutely not, Margaret declared firmly. You are officially on holiday from kitchen duty. Your only job is to enjoy yourself. The idea still felt foreign to Eleanor. Christmas without responsibility, without the careful orchestration of everyone else's joy. But as they sat on the deck overlooking the beach, eating Betty's delicious breakfast and watching dolphins play in the distance, she found herself sinking into the moment with unexpected ease. The Christmas service is at 11, Betty informed her, refilling Eleanor's coffee cup. Very casual, half the congregation will be in shorts and sandals. Then we thought we'd have a light lunch and open our modest gifts before the big event. Big event? Eleanor questioned. Margaret grinned. Betty's famous sunset Christmas dinner on the beach. She sets up a table right on the sand with proper linens and china, and we eat watching the sun go down over the Gulf. It's magical. That sounds lovely, Eleanor said, though a pang of something like homesickness fluttered through her chest. For all the stress and exhaustion of her traditional Christmas dinners, there had been a certain satisfaction in creating those experiences for her family. Betty seemed to read her thoughts. We've incorporated a little Ohio into the menu this year, she said kindly. Margaret mentioned your famous cranberry relish and chestnut stuffing, so I took the liberty of finding recipes. They won't be as good as yours, of course, but it's a small touch of home. Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. That's incredibly thoughtful. Betty, thank you. Family isn't always about blood, Betty said, patting Eleanor's hand. Sometimes it's about who shows up and makes space for you at their table. The wisdom of this statement settled over Eleanor like a warm blanket. She had spent so many years defining family narrowly: Harold, James, and now reluctantly Melissa, that she'd forgotten how the circle could expand to include those who demonstrated love through their actions rather than their obligations. As they cleared the breakfast dishes, Eleanor's phone chimed with an incoming message. Expecting another terse update from James, she was surprised to see it was from her neighbor Doris. Instead, Merry Christmas from snowy Ohio. Just wanted you to know there's been quite a commotion at your house. Catering van last night, and this morning James was there alone for about an hour. Everything okay? Eleanor frowned. puzzled by James's solo visit to her house on Christmas morning. She replied to Doris with thanks for keeping an eye on things, then sent a cautious text to James. Doris mentioned you stopped by the house this morning. Is everything all right? The reply came almost immediately. Everything's fine. Just picking up something. We'll explain later. Cryptic, but at least not angry. Eleanor tucked her phone away, determined not to let concern about Ohio events overshadow her Florida Christmas. Whatever James was doing, it would keep until her return. The beach church service was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced, held in an open-air pavilion with the Gulf of Mexico as a backdrop. It featured a small band playing Christmas carols with a distinctly Caribbean flair, the minister in festive but casual attire, and a congregation that ranged from elderly couples in pressed linen to families with small children in bathing suits and cover-ups. The first Christmas wasn't in a cathedral, the young minister reminded them during his brief sermon. It was in a humble shelter under the stars, with the most unlikely witnesses, shepherds, animals, travelers far from home. Perhaps the best way to honor that first Christmas is to find holiness in unexpected places, to recognize the sacred in the unfamiliar. Eleanor felt the words resonate deeply. She had always associated Christmas with very specific traditions, settings, and rituals. The idea that holiness could be found just as readily on a Florida beach as in her Ohio living room was both challenging and liberating. After the service, as they strolled along the shore, Eleanor spotted an elderly couple walking hand in hand near the water's edge, both white-haired, moving slowly but with evident joy in each other's company. They stopped occasionally to examine shells or simply gaze at the horizon together. "That could have been Harold and me," she said softly to Margaret. "We always talked about retiring somewhere warm, spending our golden years collecting seashells instead of shoveling snow. Why couldn't it still be you, Ellie?" Margaret asked gently. "Not with Harold, of course, but the beach, the shells, the freedom from Ohio winters that could still be your future." Eleanor watched the elderly couple disappear down the beach, still hand in hand. "I've never thought about leaving our house. It's where we raised James, where all our memories are." "Memories travel with you," Margaret observed. "And sometimes, making new ones is the best tribute to the old." The idea settled into Eleanor's mind like a seed planted in fertile soil not yet sprouting, but alive with possibility. Lunch was a casual affair of sandwiches and salad, followed by the exchange of simple gifts. Margaret and Betty had thoughtfully purchased a few items for Eleanor: a beach hat, a local artist's watercolor of the Gulf sunset, and a beautiful shell necklace. "We couldn't have you without presents on Christmas," Margaret explained. Eleanor was momentarily embarrassed that she had nothing to give in return, but Betty waved away her apologies. "Your company is gift enough. Besides, there's always next year." The casual reference to next year caught Eleanor by surprise. Would there be a next year in Florida? The thought was both exciting and unsettling. As Betty began preparations for their sunset dinner, Eleanor slipped away to call James. It was time to bridge the distance more directly than text messages allowed. The call went straight to voicemail. Eleanor left a message, keeping her tone warm and open. "Merry Christmas, James. I just wanted to hear your voice today and let you know I'm thinking of you. I hope the party was a success and that you're having a peaceful Christmas. I love you very much." She was about to hang up when an incoming call interrupted her. James, returning her call. "Mom," he said, his voice sounding tired but not angry. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, dear. How are you?" "Honestly exhausted. The party went fine. The caterer was actually amazing, but Melissa's been, well, it's been tense." Eleanor felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry for any difficulties I caused. That wasn't my intention." There was a pause. Then James said something that took her completely by surprise. "I know, Mom, and I owe you an apology. I've been thinking a lot about what you wrote in your letter, and you were right." Eleanor sat down on the edge of the bed, stunned by this unexpected turn. Dad would have been disappointed in how I've treated you. I'm disappointed in myself." His voice cracked slightly. "After he died, I don't know. I got caught up in my own life and career, and I took for granted that you'd always be there when I needed you." "Oh, James." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "When I found your letter, I was angry at first, but then I really read it, really heard what you were saying, and I realized you've been quietly unhappy for a long time. And I never even noticed." Eleanor wiped away a tear. "It wasn't all bad, James. I love being your mother, and I've always wanted to support you. But that doesn't mean you should be taken for granted or treated like household staff." The genuine remorse in his voice was balm to Eleanor's wounded heart. "Dad would have called me out on it a long time ago. Your father always did have a knack for keeping us all honest with ourselves," Eleanor agreed, smiling through her tears. "He did." James took a deep breath. "So I went to the house this morning." "Yes, Doris mentioned that." "What were you looking for?" "The Christmas plates. I wanted to surprise you when you got back. I remembered how much they meant to you and Dad, and I thought I don't know, that maybe using them properly might be a small way to start making things right." Eleanor glanced at the single Christmas plate on her desk, adorned with her Florida treasures. "That's very thoughtful, James, but they weren't in the china cabinet. I looked everywhere." "That's because I brought one with me," Eleanor admitted. "Just one, wrapped in a dish towel, a small piece of home." James laughed, a warm, genuine sound that reminded her so much of Harold. "Of course you did. Great minds think alike, I guess." There was another pause, this one more comfortable than the last. "So how's Florida for Christmas?" James asked. "Weird, different," Eleanor corrected, "but beautiful in its own way. We're having dinner on the beach at sunset tonight." "That sounds amazing. Actually, much better than the chaos here. Melissa's parents came over after you left, and her mother has been dropping hints all day about how some people just don't understand the importance of family obligations." Eleanor winced. "I'm sorry you're caught in the middle, James." "Don't be. It's not your fault." His voice took on a more serious tone. "I need to develop a backbone where Melissa's family is concerned. Dad used to tell me that, but I didn't listen. Your father was wise about many things. He was—" James cleared his throat. "Listen, Mom, when you get back, I'd like to have dinner just the two of us. There's a lot I want to talk about, a lot I need to apologize for properly." Eleanor felt a warm glow of hope. "I'd like that very much." "Great. And Mom, I'm glad you're having a good Christmas. You deserve it." After they said their goodbyes, Eleanor sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the unexpected gift of her son's apology and self-reflection. It wasn't a complete resolution of their issues, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of distance that had grown between them since Harold's death. With a lighter heart, she rejoined Margaret and Betty to help prepare for their beach dinner. The day was turning out to be a Christmas unlike any she had known before, yet somehow more meaningful than she could have imagined. The Sunset Beach dinner exceeded all of Eleanor's expectations. Betty had indeed set up a proper table on the sand, complete with a white tablecloth, fine china, and taper candles protected from the breeze by glass hurricanes. A small potted palm decorated with seashell ornaments served as their unconventional Christmas tree. The menu blended Florida and Ohio traditions' fresh local seafood alongside Betty's versions of Eleanor's cranberry relish and chestnut stuffing. A bottle of champagne chilled in an ice bucket, ready to toast the sunset. "This is absolutely magical," Eleanor said as they took their seats. The Gulf of Mexico spread before them in shades of gold and pink as the sun began its descent. "I've never experienced anything like it." "That's the beauty of new traditions," Betty said, raising her champagne glass. "They remind us that life can always surprise us with fresh joys, no matter our age." "To new traditions," Margaret echoed, lifting her glass. "And to Eleanor, for having the courage to break free and find her own path." Eleanor felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I hardly think running away to Florida qualifies as courage." "Are you kidding?" Betty exclaimed. "At 67, leaving behind everything familiar to stand up for yourself. That's the definition of courage in my book." "It wasn't a permanent break," Eleanor clarified. "I'm going back in 2 days." Margaret and Betty exchanged a glance. "Back to what, though?" Margaret asked carefully. "The same patterns, The same expectations? Eleanor considered the question as she watched the sun touch the horizon, setting the water ablaze with color. No, she said finally. Not the same. James called earlier, and we had a real conversation, the first in a long time. He apologized, said he wanted to talk when I return. That's wonderful, Betty said sincerely. A Christmas miracle of sorts. It feels like one, Eleanor admitted. But even with that bridge being rebuilt, I know things need to change. I can't go back to being everyone's support system with nothing for myself. So what will you do differently? Margaret pressed gently. Eleanor took a sip of champagne. Considering, for one thing, I'm going to be more honest about my limitations. No more agreeing to impossible tasks out of guilt or obligation. Good start, Betty nodded approvingly. And I'm going to make more time for my own interests. I used to love watercolor painting, but I haven't touched my supplies since Harold got sick. Eleanor gestured to the beautiful sunset before them. I'd love to try capturing this someday. What about your living situation? Margaret asked carefully. That big house. All those Ohio winters? Eleanor watched a pelican dive into the golden waters. I don't know yet. That house holds 42 years of memories with Harold. The idea of leaving it is complicated. Memories don't live in walls. Ellie, Betty said gently. They live in here. She tapped her chest. Take it from someone who's moved a dozen times in her life, home is portable when you know who you are. As the sun slipped below the horizon in a final blaze of glory, Eleanor felt something shifting within her, the first tentative acceptance that her life could have a second chapter. One she authored herself rather than having it dictated by others' needs and expectations. The Christmas plate she'd brought from Ohio sat at her place setting, now holding a slice of key lime pie rather than turkey and stuffing. Somehow, that small detail seemed to encapsulate everything about this transformative day tradition honored but reimagined. The familiar made new again. The remainder of Eleanor's Florida sojourn passed in a blur of beach walks, leisurely conversations, and quiet moments of reflection. Each day brought new small pleasures, collecting shells at dawn, watching dolphins from the deck, falling asleep to the rhythm of waves rather than the ticking of the grandfather clock that had dominated her Ohio bedroom for 4 decades. On her final evening, Eleanor sat with Margaret on the moonlit beach, both women wrapped in light blankets against the gentle evening breeze. I don't know how to thank you, Eleanor said, watching the silver path the moon cast across the dark water. This trip has been transformative, Margaret smiled. You don't need to thank me. Watching you rediscover yourself has been thanks enough. I feel like I've been sleepwalking for the past 3 years, Eleanor admitted. Ever since Harold died, I've just been going through the motions, trying to be useful to James, trying to fill the emptiness. Grief does that to us, Margaret nodded. It narrows our vision until we can only see what we've lost, not what might still be found. Harold wouldn't have wanted that for me. He was always pushing me to try new things, to have adventures, Eleanor sighed. I was usually the cautious one, preferring the familiar. Well, you've certainly broken that pattern, Margaret chuckled. Running away to Florida at Christmas, quite the adventure for cautious Eleanor Mitchell. Eleanor laughed softly. It sounds ridiculous when you put it that way. Not ridiculous. Brave. Margaret turned to face her friend. So what happens next? Ellie, when you go back to Ohio tomorrow, what changes? It was the question Eleanor had been pondering throughout her stay. First, I have that dinner with James, a real conversation about expectations and boundaries going forward. And Melissa? Eleanor sighed. That's more complicated. She hasn't reached out once during my stay here, which speaks volumes. Some relationships can only be managed, not fixed, Margaret observed. I'm beginning to accept that, Eleanor agreed. But I can change how I respond to her demands and manipulations. No more being guilted into impossible situations. And beyond the immediate family issues, Margaret pressed. What about Eleanor herself? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, watching the gentle waves caress the shore. I'm going to take a watercolor class at the community center. I found one that starts in January. Wonderful. And, Eleanor hesitated, then continued with more conviction. I'm going to talk to a real estate agent, not to sell immediately, but to understand my options. The house is too big for one person, and the winters are getting harder each year. Margaret's eyes widened. Florida? I don't know about Florida specifically, Eleanor smiled, but somewhere warmer, somewhere I can start fresh. Not running away from memories, but making space for new ones. Betty and I would love having you nearby, Margaret said, trying and failing to keep the excitement from her voice. But wherever you land, the important thing is that you're thinking about your own future now. I am, Eleanor realized with some surprise. For the first time in a very long time. I'm actually looking forward to what comes next. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the waves and watching the stars. Tomorrow would bring the return to Ohio, to snow and complications and difficult conversations. But Eleanor would be returning as a different woman than the one who had fled not just a mother, not just a widow, but Eleanor Mitchell, a woman with her own path to forge. The flight back to Ohio the next day brought Eleanor full circle, descending through gray clouds into the snow-covered landscape of Cleveland. Margaret had seen her off at the Fort Myers airport with a warm hug and a promise, "This isn't goodbye, it's just intermission." As the taxi approached her house, Eleanor felt a curious blend of familiarity and strangeness, as if seeing her home through new eyes. The Christmas wreath still hung on the front door. The lights James had helped her string along the eaves twinkled against the early evening darkness, and smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. Smoke from the chimney, Eleanor frowned, momentarily concerned that something was wrong, until she noticed James's car in the driveway. He must have come to welcome her home, perhaps even lit a fire in the fireplace to warm the house for her arrival. The taxi driver helped her with her suitcase, and Eleanor approached her front door with a mixture of trepidation and hope. Before she could insert her key, the door swung open to reveal James, casually dressed in jeans and a sweater, looking more relaxed than she had seen him in years. "Welcome home, Mom," he said, stepping forward to embrace her. The hug was genuine and lingering, reminiscent of the affectionate boy he had once been, rather than the distracted man he had become. "This is a lovely surprise," Eleanor said as she entered the house, immediately noticing the delicious aroma filling the air. "Are you cooking?" "Trying to," James admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "I found a recipe for Dad's famous beef stew, but I'm pretty sure I'm doing it wrong. It doesn't smell quite the way I remember." Eleanor was touched beyond words. Harold's beef stew had been a family favorite, a dish he had prided himself on perfecting over decades. That James would attempt to recreate it for her homecoming spoke volumes. "Let me put my bag down, and I'll come help," she offered, moving toward the stairs. "Actually, I thought we could eat in the dining room," James said, suddenly looking nervous. "I've already set the table." Curious, Eleanor followed him into the formal dining room, a space she rarely used since Harold's passing. What she saw there brought tears to her eyes. The table was beautifully set for two, with Harold's favorite tablecloth, the good silver, and most touching of all, two of the Christmas plates, carefully positioned at each place setting. "I hope it's okay that I used these," James said uncertainly. "I know how special they are to you." "It's more than okay," Eleanor assured him, blinking back tears. "It's perfect." As they sat down to the slightly imperfect beef stew, James had been heavy-handed with the time. Eleanor marveled at the full-circle journey of the past week, from feeling undervalued and invisible to sitting across from her son, being truly seen perhaps for the first time since Harold's death. "I meant what I said on Christmas," James told her as they ate. "I've been a terrible son these past few years. After Dad died, I couldn't handle seeing you so sad. So I threw myself into work, into the relationship with Melissa. It was easier than facing the grief. We all cope in different ways," Eleanor said gently. "I understand that now." "But understanding doesn't make it right," James insisted. "You deserved better from me. Dad would have expected better." Eleanor reached across the table to take his hand. "Your father was never one for dwelling on mistakes. He believed in learning from them and moving forward." "That's what I want to do," James said earnestly. "Move forward, Be a better son. But I need to know what you need from me. Mom, really need not what you think you should say to make me feel better. The question was an invitation to the kind of honest conversation they should have had years ago. Eleanor took a deep breath and spoke from her heart. I need to be seen as a person, James, not just as your mother. I need you to understand that I have limitations, that I'm getting older, that sometimes I need help rather than being the one who always provides it. She squeezed his hand. But mostly, I need time with you, real time, not just hurried visits or phone calls while you're driving to work. James nodded solemnly. I can do that. I want to do that. And I need to make some changes in my own life, Eleanor continued, deciding to share her emerging plans. This house is too big for me now. The winters are getting harder. I've been thinking it might be time to consider other options. James looked surprised, but not shocked. Like Florida, Margaret mentioned her sister has a place there. Possibly Florida. Possibly somewhere else. I don't know yet, but somewhere I can start fresh. Maybe discover new interests, new aspects of myself. Instead of the resistance she had half expected, James looked thoughtful. Dad always said you had an artist's soul that never got enough nurturing. He'd be thrilled to see you exploring that side of yourself. He did say that, didn't he? Eleanor smiled at the memory. I'd forgotten. He told me once that his biggest regret was not taking you to Paris like he promised when you were first married. He said you had dreams of painting by the Seine. Eleanor felt a bittersweet pang. We always thought there would be time later, when you were grown, when the mortgage was paid off. And then his heart. It's not too late for Paris, Mom, James said quietly, or for painting, or for whatever else you've put aside all these years. The simple truth of his statement hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that Eleanor's life was still unfolding, still full of possibilities, despite loss and despite age. What about Melissa? Eleanor finally asked, addressing the elephant in the room. She hasn't reached out once since I left. James sighed, looking down at his plate. Melissa and I have been doing some reassessing since Christmas Eve. The party was successful professionally, but it highlighted some fundamental differences in our values. She was furious about your letter, not because you left, but because you called her out on using you. I never meant to come between you, Eleanor said, concerned. You didn't. If anything, you held up a mirror that showed us some uncomfortable truths. James met her eyes directly. Melissa comes from a family where status and appearances matter above all else. I knew that when I married her, but I didn't fully understand how it would affect our life together, or how it would impact my relationship with you. These things are complicated, Eleanor offered, not wanting to speak ill of her daughter-in-law despite everything. They are, James agreed, but they're also clarifying. Watching Melissa's reaction to your absence, the anger, the focus on how it made her look rather than concern for why you felt you had to leave, made me realize how far I've drifted from the values Dad and you raised me with. Eleanor didn't know how to respond to this candid assessment, so she simply listened. I don't know what the future holds for Melissa and me, James continued, but I do know that I want a better relationship with you, whatever happens, and I want to support your choices, whether that means moving to Florida or taking up painting or anything else that brings you joy. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. That's the greatest gift you could give me, James. Your understanding and support. They finished their meal talking about lighter subjects, James's work projects that genuinely excited him, Eleanor's adventures in Florida, shared memories of holidays past with Harold. For the first time in years, there was no checking of phones, no hurried glances at watches, just present, attentive conversation. As they cleared the dishes together, another small but significant change, Eleanor carefully washed the Christmas plates by hand. You know, she said, holding one up to the light. Your father always said these plates weren't just for Christmas. He bought them for our anniversary because he believed every day had the potential to be special if we chose to see it that way. James smiled, taking the plate from her to dry it. He was right about that, like he was right about most things. I think, Eleanor said thoughtfully, that from now on, I'll use these plates whenever there's something to celebrate, big or small. No more saving them for once a year. I think Dad would approve of that. James nodded. After the kitchen was clean, they moved to the living room where James had maintained the fire. Sitting side by side on the sofa, watching the flames dance, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle over her. I brought something back from Florida for you, she said, reaching into her handbag. She pulled out the sand dollar Margaret had found on their Christmas Eve walk. It's not much, but it's a reminder that beauty can be found in unexpected places. James accepted the delicate treasure with careful hands. It's perfect, Mom. Thank you. He hesitated, then added, I have something for you, too. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to Eleanor. Inside was a gift certificate for a series of advanced watercolor classes at the Cleveland Institute of Art. How did you know? Eleanor asked, astonished. I found your old supplies in the attic when I was looking for the Christmas decorations this year. The brushes, the half-used paints, the pad with a few beautiful beginnings. He shrugged. It seemed like something you loved that got set aside somewhere along the way. Eleanor was deeply touched by this evidence that her son had seen her, really seen her as more than just his mother, but as a woman with passions and interests of her own. Thank you, James. This means more than you know. As the evening drew to a close and James prepared to leave, he embraced Eleanor once more at the door. I meant everything I said tonight. Mom, things are going to be different from now on. I believe you, Eleanor said, and she was surprised to realize she truly did. After he left, Eleanor moved through her house with a curious sense of detachment. The rooms that had once seemed so full of Harold's presence and then so empty after his death now felt like a chapter that was gently closing, not with grief or regret, but with appreciation for what had been and anticipation for what might still be. She took the remaining Christmas plates from the china cabinet and arranged them on the dining room table. No longer precious artifacts to be protected, but beautiful objects meant to be used and enjoyed. Tomorrow, she would have her breakfast on one. The day after, perhaps lunch. In the quiet of her bedroom, Eleanor unpacked her suitcase, carefully removing the Florida treasures she had collected: shells, the watercolor of the sunset, the beach hat. Rather than tucking them away as souvenirs, she arranged them on her dresser where she would see them every day, reminders of possibility, of courage, of the unexpected joys that could arrive even at 67. On impulse, she opened her laptop and began searching for information about long-term rentals in Naples, not for an immediate move, but as a first step in exploring options, a seed planted, waiting for the right time to grow. Outside, snow began falling again, dusting the Ohio landscape with fresh white powder. Eleanor watched it from her window, appreciating its beauty while allowing herself to imagine warm Gulf breezes instead. I think I'm finally learning. Harold, she whispered into the quiet room, I'm learning that taking care of my heart doesn't mean betraying anyone else's. It just means making room for my own happiness, alongside theirs. She could almost hear his reply, warm and encouraging as it had always been. That's my girl, Ellie. Better late than never. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had begun with those broken Christmas plans, a journey that had taken her from Ohio to Florida and back again. But more importantly, from a woman defined solely by her relationships to others, to a woman beginning to define herself. The Christmas plates hadn't been broken after all, just used in new and unexpected ways, one carrying seashells in Florida, two hosting a reconciliatory dinner in Ohio, the rest waiting to celebrate ordinary days made special simply by the decision to see them that way. Like the plates, Eleanor herself hadn't been broken by grief or neglect, merely waiting for a new purpose, a new way of being in the world. At 67, her story wasn't ending with Harold's death or James's marriage or even with her Christmas rebellion. It was, perhaps, just beginning. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on a small balcony overlooking the Gulf of Mexico, watching another magnificent sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The rental condo she had leased for 3 months was modest but perfect close to the beach, within walking distance of shops and restaurants, and most importantly, filled with light ideal for painting. Her easel stood in the corner of the living room, surrounded by canvases in various stages of completion. The watercolor class James had gifted her had rekindled a passion she had nearly forgotten, and she had discovered a particular talent for capturing the ever-changing moods of the sea and sky. The Ohio house was not yet sold. Eleanor had decided to take her time with that transition, spending summers in Ohio and winters in Florida while she determined where she ultimately wanted to settle. James had supported her decision completely, even helping her find the Naples rental and flying down to help her get settled. Things between James and Melissa remained complicated. They were in counseling, trying to bridge the significant gaps in their values and expectations. Eleanor maintained a polite distance from their marital issues, available to listen when James needed to talk, but careful not to interfere or take sides. Her relationship with her son, however, had been transformed. They spoke at least twice a week, had regular video calls where he asked to see her latest paintings, and he had already booked a flight to visit her in August, with or without Melissa. A notification chimed on her phone, a text from Margaret, who was visiting her sister again and wanted to meet for dinner the following evening. Eleanor replied with an enthusiastic yes, grateful for the friendship that had given her the courage to reimagine her life. As she turned to go inside, Eleanor caught sight of the Christmas plate displayed on her small dining table. She had brought all of them to Florida this time, using them regularly for everything from breakfast to dinner parties with her growing circle of new friends. Tonight, the plate held a seashell she had found that morning, a perfect spiral that seemed to embody the journey she had undertaken. Beginning from a small, tight center, it expanded outward in ever-widening curves, growing more expansive with each turn. "Just like life, Harold," she said softly to the sunset. "It keeps spiraling outward as long as we're brave enough to let it." There was no audible response, of course, but Eleanor didn't need one. She knew in her heart that Harold would approve of the woman she was becoming, not despite her age, but because of it, carrying the wisdom of her years while embracing the possibilities that still lay ahead. Eleanor Mitchell, mother, widow, artist, and finally, most importantly, herself turned toward her easel, picked up a brush, and began to paint the glorious sunset before it faded, capturing the moment when one day ended and the promise of another waited just below the horizon.